Hey everybody, this is Talk Show and my name is Jocelyn Thompson. Today we're going to be talking about W.E.B. Du Bois and his viewpoint on World War I before, during, and after. And really quick, I just want to introduce Ricky Martinez. He's going to be talking about Du Bois's experience in college and what he did during that period. Hi Ricky, how are you doing? Thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So really quick, I have a question. What is something significant that W.E.B. Du Bois did during his college experience?
When W.E.B. Du Bois was in college, just like us, he noticed a lot of racism going on around him. And rather than just sit back and let it pass, he decided to do something about it. Du Bois founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, on February 12, 1909, which happens to be Lincoln's 100th birthday, with 60 black and white citizens. With violence happening all around them, the NAACP decided to take a different approach to the ongoing battle of racism with a nonviolence agenda. Founded on the basis of nonviolent protest and legal action, they felt that they could make the country better not only for themselves but for all Americans. Du Bois became a member of the board and edited a journal of opinions called The Crisis. The NAACP saw early success in winning legal cases and ensuring the rights for minorities. One of the most notable cases that the NAACP was a part of was the Supreme Court ruling that the ordinance in Louisville, Kentucky that required blacks to live in certain sections of the city, noting that it violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. In 1934, Du Bois left the NAACP because of opposing viewpoints. Du Bois wanted African Americans to control institutions, schools, and economic corporations, which opposed the NAACP's commitment to integrity. Du Bois returned to the NAACP as Director of Special Research for a brief stint in 1944 and stayed until 48. During this period, he was active in placing the grievances of African Americans before the United Nations, serving as a consultant to the UN founding convention and in 1945 and writing the famous An Appeal to the World in 1947. Thanks, Jocelyn.
No problem. So moving along to our next guest that we have is Dr. Bryson Patel, and he's going to be talking about W.E.B. Du Bois's thoughts on the impact of World War I on African Americans.
Hi, Jocelyn.
Hey.
It's nice to finally meet you in person.
Thank you so much for coming to my show. So really quick, I have a question for you. What was W.E.B. Du Bois's viewpoint on World War I and black soldiers?
Right, so he actually published an essay that I think is exemplary of his thoughts on World War I. And he published that in 1919, but I'd actually like to take it a little bit farther back towards like the beginning of the war.
Okay.
So we're talking like 1914-ish, that sort of time period.
Right.
Around this time, there was a lot of discrimination in the U.S., obviously.
Right.
There still is, to an
Right.
extent. So back then, it was even worse, as you might imagine. And W.E.B. Du Bois, unlike his peers, he kind of differed from the norm. He actually supported the war effort.
Right.
Many of his peers at the time said that they thought it was a white man's war. They didn't really support it because
of how they were being treated.
Exactly. They thought the country didn't deserve their support, basically. So Du Bois, actually, to prove his support, he funded and co-founded camps that would train officers, African-American officers. And to an extent, these were actually successful. Not wildly successful. There were probably about 600 officers that were enlisted.
Why wasn't it successful?
So, I mean, from one perspective, you could say this was the first time there were ever officers, African-American officers. So in that sense, it was successful. But relative to the amount of white officers there were not very many black officers. And the vast majority of all black soldiers were actually in these servant positions. Despite their desire to fight and support their country, they were oftentimes treated somewhat like slaves, like they were in the past.
Being reintroduced into those roles.
Exactly. Like the highest rank, I believe, that many would attain was like corporal in all black regiments. And so also an interesting snippet was that the commanders of said black regiments were oftentimes Southern whites. So they were supposedly said to know how to best handle a Negro.
Power dynamic. basically.
Exactly. Very familiar to us, something we've seen throughout history. You know, it was the same, the plantation owner and the slaves dynamic. The exact same thing going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, despite all these negative things that I've listed off, Du Bois actually came out of the war expecting good things, like the fruits of this effort were very good in his opinion, because overseas in France, the blacks actually experienced a different atmosphere that was unique to them. They actually saw a different perspective because the French people and the French officers were supportive of them and very accepting. Yeah.
Inclusive.
Which was in stark contrast to the American officers.
Right.
At the same time, like they were seeing the American officers and the French officers.
Right. And I guarantee you that they would probably go further in ranking.
Exactly. Definitely. And so at the end of the day, he said that for the first time, African Americans witnessed the dawn of true democracy for them in France.
Okay.
So when they came home, it was inevitable that they would pursue their rights more in the U.S.
Right, demand equal citizenship, not secondary.
Like they saw in France. So I'd like to actually end on this quote from an essay towards the history of the black man in the war that Du Bois wrote. He said, "There is not a black soldier but who is glad he went, glad to fight for France, the only real white democracy, glad to have a new, clear vision of the real inner spirit of American prejudice. The day of camouflage is past." I think that's a very powerful statement.
It is. It definitely talks about the hypocrisy that you basically just explained about allowing black soldiers in the war but not allowing them to fight for the country. So it's like this weird, yeah, you can fight, but you're still not viewed as an American citizen. And then it's like in France, you're not even a Frenchman, but you're treated like you are. You weren't even born there.
Right.
Which is like a very interesting perspective that they took back home. Thank you so much for that insight.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me today.
No problem. Come back. Hey y'all, so the next person we have coming is Kyle Dong, and he's going to be talking about Booker T and W.E.B. Du Bois's opposing views about African Americans and their acceptance in white America.
Hi, Jocelyn.
Hey, thank you so much for coming on my show.
Thanks for having me. I'm a huge fan of it.
Oh, that's so cool. So I have one quick question for you.
All right.
What was W.E.B. Du Bois's and Booker T. Washington's views about African Americans being accepted into America?
Okay, so before we talk about the opposing views, I'm going to talk about Booker T. Washington so that the fans will understand his background.
Okay.
Well, Booker T. Washington was a unique African American. And what I mean by that is that his mom was a slave while his dad was a slave owner. So he may appear just African American, but he is also half white.
Right.
Now, in the later years, I feel that it might have played a role because Booker T urged for that African Americans just continue on accepting discrimination and just know that eventually white people will accept them for who they were.
Right.
Now, this was different in a way because, he always believed that that African Americans should just keep their educations into crafts, hard work, labor, jobs, instead of trying to focus on political views.
Right. Keeping that comfortability of keeping African Americans in domestic jobs, which is like reinforcing slavery in a sense.
Yeah. So that's why it was unique because Booker T was his perspective. It got accepted by a lot of white people. So it was a good way for African Americans, for some, to try to accept Booker T because they thought, well, okay, if white people are accepting his ideals, we'll continue with his perspective because maybe we'll be accepted.
Right.
So it was very different in a way. He also would think that it was, I guess, different and unique of having just the same roles. Like white people will always seem like the very high social power, while African Americans were just more of just the domestic worker. And this was huge because W. Du Bois, he totally was against this. He believed that Booker T was pushing for just white oppression, and that that African Americans should focus on not just domestic labor, but they should be trying to urge for political rights and just studying those social aspects. W. Du Bois also pushed for the whole idea of the talented 10th.
What is the talented 10th?
The talented 10th is, for the viewers out there that don't know, are college-educated African Americans who W. Du Bois wanted to come back into the communities of African Americans and educate them about different perspectives like social views, political rights, and just to help the community know that that African Americans are just as equal and should be have just the same opportunity as whites, because they're just as capable of understanding the whole system and learning these same things.
Right.
So, in a way, Booker T and W. Du Bois are the same because they both push for the same idea of change for African Americans.
Right.
It's like having having two people in a political party being represented, because they both push for the same, I guess, views. The only difference is that they each have a different approach to it.
Right.
So Booker T's was very laid back and just go with the flow, which was just keep the roles and eventually we'll be accepted.
Yeah, don't challenge the white supremacy.
Yeah, which is why that was, I guess, not highly accepted, but a minority of the African American community accepted it still, because they noticed, well, Booker T was being accepted, we'll accept it.
Right.
While majority was still trying to push with W. Du Bois's views, which was, okay, noticing how the talented 10th would educate them and saying, okay, we're just as capable. Hey, why can't we just learn the same thing? Why can't we push for the same views?
Right. I think that the issue maybe that is being proposed is that for most African Americans that accepted Booker T's view is that there's no backlash as opposed to Du Bois's. And so you bring up a really good point. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I thought these two leaders, they both had great ideals, great meaning in trying to do what they wanted to do. I just believe that W. Du Bois's was the most ideal because it pushed for the political change and aspect.
And this definitely contributed to the viewpoints of World War I as well.
Yeah, because in the World War I, you saw there are some soldiers that were like, oh, I shouldn't be fighting. I should still just be doing this domestic work, which was the Booker T. Washington ideal. While W. Du Bois is like, no, change it, go fight. Represent our country,
Right.
because you're just as capable and equal of fighting or representing of who we are, because
Right.
we're all Americans in the end.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming on my show.
Oh, of course. Thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
So that is all that we have for tonight. Thanks for our experts for joining us. That would be Ricky, Bryce, and Kyle. And thank you, the viewers, for tuning in on our segment that we had on W.E.B. Du Bois's influence and perspective around the time of World War I. Good night, Harlem. No, not ready. We're going to be talking with a few experts that have specialty focus in those areas, so stay tuned. Anyway, so moving along, the next guest that I want to bring on is Dr. Bryson Bertel, and he's going to be talking about the WEB's
to train African Americans to join the armed forces, which was not a very popular opinion at the time. This indicates that he encouraged African Americans to join the war despite some people calling it a white man's war. So many African Americans were of the belief that